"You're fired," Kyle Norton said, loud and clean, like he wanted the words to carry. He didn't ask me to step aside. He didn't lower his voice. He stood right there in the middle of the floor, hands on his hips, making sure people heard him. A few heads lifted, screens stayed on, but no one was working. "This company needs momentum," Kyle continued, "and you're slowing it down." I looked at him and said, "Evenly, say that again." He smiled, sharp and impatient. "You resist innovation. You cling to outdated operating models. And you don't fit the new growth strategy we're executing." Kyle reminded everyone within earshot that the board had hired him as general manager to modernize the company. "I was given full authority to restructure leadership," he said. "That includes removing blockers." Blockers. That's what he called me. I asked who approved the termination. He waved his hand like the question wasn't worth answering. "This isn't a discussion," Kyle said. "Operations always fight change. That's why they get replaced." The word hung there, replaced heavy and deliberate. I was the director of operations and facilities. I built the systems that kept this place functioning when growth outpaced common sense. I negotiated the site lease, stabilized costs, and designed workflows that prevented outages from becoming disasters. When this company was still duct-taped together, I was the one holding it upright. Kyle had been here 6 weeks. He nodded toward IT, already standing by. "Disable her access." My badge stopped responding before I could hand it over. My inbox refreshed once, then locked me out completely. Someone said, quietly, "You'll need to clear your desk now." Kyle looked pleased. "We're moving fast," he said. "That's the future." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I packed slowly my notebook, my charger, a photo from the year we finally turned profitable. Around me, the office returned to motion, the relief of not being next mixing with unease. Before I left, I opened my phone and sent a single email to the board's executive secretary. No context, no explanation. Just a subject line, notice of contractual adjustment. Effective tomorrow. Kyle Norton thought he had just cleared an obstacle. He had no idea what he'd destabilized. Before this goes any further, take a second. How are you holding up today if you're heading outside later? Make sure you bundle up and stay warm, and let me know where you're listening from. If this story is hitting close to home, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Kyle set in motion doesn't end here, it accelerates. By the time I reached my car, the anger had settled into something heavier. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just a slow, grinding pressure that came from watching years of work dismissed with a wave of someone else's hand. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat there long enough to remember exactly how we got here. This company almost collapsed 8 years ago. Cash flow was bleeding out through bad leases, bloated vendor contracts, and operational shortcuts that looked cheap until they failed. While executives debated branding and vision decks, I renegotiated everything that kept the lights on. I cut operating costs without cutting capability. I restructured service agreements, extended payment terms, and stabilized margins long enough for revenue to recover. That wasn't strategy theater, that was survival. When we outgrew the old building, I chose the current site myself. I walked it with engineers, inspectors, and lawyers. I signed the lease after 6 months of negotiation, locking in terms that gave the company flexibility when growth stalled and leverage when it didn't. No one questioned it then. They were too busy celebrating expansion. Kyle Norton never saw any of that. He came from financial consulting, the kind where confidence matters more than consequences. He spoke fluently in charts, benchmarks, and urgency. Every problem looked like excess. Every delay looked like incompetence. To him, operations weren't a foundation, they were overhead. I heard it in the way he talked about my department. "Facilities people are always replaceable," he said once, smiling like he'd made a clever observation instead of an insult. I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned that reacting only made people like Kyle louder. In meetings, he questioned why we needed redundancy, why systems were built to last instead of scale fast. He praised lean models and mocked caution. When something worked quietly, he ignored it. When it cost money visibly, he targeted it. That was his idea of leadership. What hurt most wasn't the dismissal, it was the erasure. The way years of responsibility were reduced to a line item. The way competence was treated like resistance. I swallowed it all, because responding emotionally would only confirm his narrative. What he never did was read past the summary pages. He skimmed contracts. He trusted assumptions. He believed authority replaced understanding. He confused speed with competence and disruption with intelligence. People like Kyle always did. Sitting there in my car, replaying his words. I remembered the clause buried deep in the lease documents, the one tied to governance changes, the one no consultant ever lingered on. Kyle thought he had cut a cost. He had no idea what he had just activated inside the structure of everything. Clarity arrived after the noise faded. Anger gave way to arithmetic. And that was where I was strongest. I didn't rush. I opened the files I knew by muscle memory. The ones I'd assembled quietly while everyone else chased speed. The building everyone called headquarters never belonged to the company. It couldn't have, not then. When we signed the lease, the balance sheet was fragile and lenders were nervous. Ownership would have killed the deal. So I structured a joint venture, a clean property entity with patient capital and strict governance. I controlled it. The company leased space from it, arm's length, fully disclosed, approved by council, and renewed twice without comment. I remembered the weeks of negotiation like they were yesterday. Inspections, contingencies, abatements, escalation caps. I wrote the operating schedules myself because I knew how failure traveled through a building. Cooling, power, access, redundancy. The lease mirrored operations, not the other way around. That detail mattered. Buried past the summaries sat a clause everyone skimmed. If a change in executive control materially altered operational structure, rent could be adjusted to market within 24 hours' notice. It wasn't punitive. It was protective. A guardrail against reckless leadership that treated infrastructure as expendable. Legal signed it. The board approved it. No one argued because no one expected it to be relevant. Kyle didn't read that far. He never did. He trusted briefs and decks and authority letters. When he talked about cutting facilities, he assumed contracts were inert. He assumed ownership equaled leverage. He assumed wrong. The timing mattered. Earlier that morning, Kyle circulated a memo titled Corporate Restructuring Authority. It looked harmless, procedural, empowering. He signed it and had the chair countersign. With that signature, he formally altered governance in a way that directly affected operations. He did it to move fast. He did it to look decisive. I watched the pieces align without emotion. The joint venture's rights were clear. The notice window was clean. Market comps were current. I didn't need permission. I needed precision. I drafted the notice once, then again, cutting adjectives until only facts remained. Addressed properly. Delivered correctly. Effective tomorrow. Control isn't loud, it's quiet and documented. By the time I closed the folder, the outcome was no longer a possibility. It was a process already underway. I stayed calm because calm keeps edges sharp. Every step followed paper, not pride. The lease allowed adjustment. The authority triggered it. And the market set the number. Nothing personal, nothing rushed. Just cause and effect. Kyle believed control came from titles. I knew it lived in signatures, clauses, and timing. Tomorrow would prove which belief actually governed reality. I had prepared for outcome for years. Don't leave, yet the next part is where everything starts to shift. Precision matters when pressure rises. I didn't write the message in anger. I wrote it the way contracts are meant to be activated. Clean and narrow. No commentary, no accusations. Just the mechanism doing what it was designed to do. The email went out at 10:30, addressed to the property lease administrator. The subject line was neutral, almost boring. In the body, one paragraph stated the adjustment effective in 24 hours. Base rent would increase by 300%, recalculated to current market benchmarks. A second paragraph cited the clause. Section and page number. That was all. I added recipients carefully, every voting board member, the chief financial officer, internal legal counsel, no drama, just visibility. If anyone wanted to claim surprise later, the record would disagree. Within minutes, my phone started vibrating. I didn't answer. I knew the first calls would be noise. Panic always arrives before comprehension. The CFO left a voicemail. Voice tight. Willa! This has to be a mistake. Call me immediately. Legal followed, more controlled. We've received your notice. Reviewing now. I stayed still. I opened the lease again, scrolling slowly. Not because I needed reassurance, but because repetition sharpens confidence. The clause was exactly where I remembered it. Clear trigger language, clear remedy, clear timing. An hour later, legal called back. This time, the tone was different. We've reviewed the notice, the attorney said. It complies with the lease terms. I asked one question. Is it enforceable? There was a pause. Then a careful answer. Yes, it is. That was the moment everything shifted. By mid-afternoon, Kyle's number lit up my screen. I let it ring. When I finally answered, he didn't bother with greetings. What the hell is this? He demanded. You can't just triple our rent. I didn't, I said. The contract did. You're trying to pressure the company, he snapped. No, I replied evenly. You changed governance. The clause adjusted price. That's how agreements work. He accused me of sabotage, of retaliation, of playing games. I let him finish. Then I said, this isn't personal, it's procedural. Silence followed, heavy and disbelieving. I ended the call and set the phone face down. The leverage was no longer theoretical. It was active, documented, and acknowledged by legal. Nothing I did after that would change the outcome. The mechanism was engaged, and the company was now moving on terms it had agreed to long before Kyle arrived. From that point forward, every decision inside those walls would be constrained by math, contracts, and time, not slogans or authority. And I intended to let that reality apply steady, unavoidable pressure until consequences reached the people who believed speed replaced responsibility entirely. Chaos doesn't arrive loudly at first. It leaks. The morning after my notice went out, Kyle Norton proved that faster than any spreadsheet ever could. My phone rang before sunrise, his name flashing like a warning. I let it ring, knowing silence would irritate him more than any answer. When I finally picked up, he exploded. You think this is clever? He shouted. You're trying to cripple the company. His voice cracked between anger and panic, the sound of someone realizing control was slipping. He threatened lawsuits, personal liability, blacklisting. I said nothing until he paused for breath. Then I replied, read the lease. He hung up. Inside the company, confusion spread quickly. The CFO discovered what Kyle never bothered to confirm: relocation wasn't possible in the short term. The lease on every potential alternative space required months of approvals, inspections, and capital commitments they didn't have. Worse, several major client contracts explicitly tied service continuity to the registered operating address. Move the building, breach the deal. I heard the CFO say it over speaker during a frantic call. We can't just move, he said. The address is locked into compliance filings. Someone asked how long they had. His answer was blunt. Not long. Kyle tried to project confidence anyway. He called an emergency meeting and declared the rent adjustment temporary noise. He told executives to stay focused and accused me of overplaying my hand. Behind closed doors, his confidence collapsed. Emails flew, calendars filled with red exclamation points. No one had a solution that didn't involve time they no longer controlled. By mid-afternoon, the bank called. Not Kyle, not legal. The bank called finance directly. We're reviewing your exposure, the relationship manager said. A sudden cost increase of this magnitude raises liquidity concerns. That sentence changed everything. The moment the word liquidity entered the conversation, panic went public. Credit terms tightened. Vendors asked for reassurance. One quietly requested prepayment. Kyle started calling again, his tone shifting from threats to bargaining. We can talk, he said. You don't have to do this. I listened, calm and detached. This wasn't escalation. It was consequence unfolding exactly as designed. The company wasn't collapsing because of me. It was unraveling because Kyle mistook authority for understanding. The chaos he felt wasn't an attack. It was exposure, spreading faster than he could contain. And it had only just begun. I knew the pressure would force decisions, and decisions would reveal competence or its absence. Kyle had chosen speed over structure, volume over detail. Now every unanswered question multiplied. I stayed silent, not out of fear, but patience, letting the system respond exactly as it was built to respond, without urgency, without mercy, without intervention. If you were me at this moment, what would you do? Leave a comment below. Pressure makes people reckless. By the second day, Kyle Norton stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and went straight to confrontation. He wanted a reversal, and he wanted it fast. HR called first. The director spoke carefully, like every word was being recorded. Kyle has requested we issue a clarification, she said. He wants it stated that you no longer hold any operational authority connected to the company. I didn't raise my voice. I don't, I replied. I'm not an employee. There was a pause. Papers shuffled. He's insisting that your actions constitute abuse of control, she continued. That you're leveraging insider influence. Ask him to define insider, I said. Then call me back. 10 minutes later, Kyle called himself. You're overstepping, he snapped. You don't get to weaponize assets against the company. I'm enforcing a contract, I said. One you're bound by. You're acting like you still run operations, he shot back. HR agrees you don't. I agree, I said calmly. Which is why conflict of interest doesn't apply. He laughed, sharp and humorless. My lawyers are drafting papers as we speak. You'll be sued for interference. Good, I said. Make sure they read the separation timestamp. That shut him up for half a second. Legal confirmed it later that afternoon. My attorney called with the kind of tone lawyers use when things are clean. You're no longer an employee, he said. You have no fiduciary duty to the company. Exercising rights as a controlling party in a property entity does not constitute interference. So there's no conflict. I asked. None, he said. They don't have a case. Kyle didn't like that answer. He tried a different tactic. He pushed HR to circulate a memo questioning my authority retroactively. Something vague enough to scare junior staff, but meaningless legally. It backfired. Legal flagged it within minutes. Do not distribute, they wrote. Unsupported and inaccurate. That's when he rushed. In his panic to regain leverage, Kyle approved a supplemental agreement tied to short-term liquidity relief. He didn't read it closely. He delegated review to a junior associate and signed electronically to keep things moving. The document referenced the lease adjustment as uncontested, locking it into financial forecasts and compliance filings. He handed me proof without realizing it. When I saw the signature, I felt nothing dramatic, just confirmation. He had validated the adjustment in writing while trying to escape it. That wasn't strategy. That was desperation. Kyle called one last time that evening. Voice tight. We can still fix this, he said. I answered honestly. You already made it worse. Silence followed. The kind that means someone is finally realizing the fight they picked was never about force. It was about precision, and they had already lost control of it. Collapse doesn't announce itself with drama. It spreads through invoices, calendars, and quiet decisions. By the third day, the consequences of Kyle's choices moved faster than anyone could contain. I watched it unfold without comment. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. The first cracks came from suppliers. Longtime vendors began requesting prepayment before shipments. One email read, "Given recent volatility, revised terms will apply immediately." Another followed within minutes. Then another. What Kyle had dismissed as temporary noise was now altering trust. And trust is expensive to rebuild. Operations felt it next. 2 senior managers resigned within hours of each other. No speeches, no ultimatums, just short notices citing instability and personal reasons. They had reputations to protect. Staying meant explaining decisions they hadn't made. Leaving was quieter. Clients noticed before leadership admitted anything was wrong. A major account paused its renewal, asking for assurances that service continuity wouldn't be disrupted. Legal couldn't provide them. Compliance filings listed the headquarters address. Any uncertainty around that address triggered review. The pause spread. One delay invited another. Kyle tried to rally confidence. He sent emails about resilience and momentum. They were ignored. Meetings ended early. Cameras stayed off. People don't need instructions when they sense gravity shifting. The company's posture changed from aggressive to defensive in less than 48 hours. Finance tightened approvals, procurement stalled. Every decision waited on another decision that never arrived. Momentum, Kyle's favorite word, vanished. Then the board stepped in. An emergency meeting was scheduled for that evening. Invitations went out quietly, precise and selective. I received one. Kyle did not. His name was absent from the agenda entirely. No presentation slot, no opening remarks, just a note stating attendance was limited. That was the moment the collapse became official. I didn't celebrate, I observed. Systems fail in predictable patterns when leadership confuses authority with understanding. Remove the wrong person, stress the wrong structure, and the damage cascades without emotion. Here's the lesson I carried forward. Small but durable power isn't proven by how fast you act, but by how well what you touch survives after you do. Kyle moved quickly. The organization couldn't keep up. Nobody asked me to intervene. Nobody could. The system was past correction mode, running on inertia and clauses already triggered. Calls overlapped, documents revised themselves, and silence replaced authority. This wasn't revenge. It was math catching up. Line by line, consequence following decision with no room left for negotiation. Nothing here required emotion, permission, or escalation anymore from anyone at all. By the time I joined the call, the company was already bracing for impact. The chain reaction was complete. All that remained was accountability, and it was arriving without mercy. When the boardroom doors closed, the noise finally had a shape, not panic, not anger focus, the kind that settles when consequences become unavoidable. I took a seat without greeting anyone, because greetings would have implied negotiation. Kyle spoke first. He always did. This situation was created by a former employee acting in bad faith, he said. Eyes fixed on the table. She's exploiting legacy access to harm the company. No one interrupted him. I waited until he finished, then slid 3 documents across the table. I won't editorialize, I said. These speak clearly on their own. The lease came first. Highlighted sections, clean tabs, signatures intact. I explained who owned the property, how the structure had been disclosed, and when the board had approved it. No embellishment, just dates and initials. Next came the email chain, time-stamped notices, delivery confirmations, and legal acknowledgments. Each message showed notice, response, and validation. The timeline was linear, boring, and airtight. Finally, the clause Kyle never read. The adjustment language was short, unemotional, and precise. Triggered by governance change, enforced by market benchmarks, executed within contract. Kyle shifted in his chair. She's twisting intent, he snapped. This was never meant to be used like this. I looked up. Intent doesn't override language, I said. You didn't just fire me, you destabilized the ground your strategy stands on. That landed. The room went quiet. Not stunned, but settled. A few board members nodded. One stopped taking notes entirely. Kyle tried again. We needed speed, he said. She resisted change. She protected continuity. I replied. You removed it. The chair cleared her throat. Kyle, we've reviewed the documents independently, she said. Legal has confirmed their validity. Kyle leaned forward. So what? You're siding with her. This isn't sides, she answered. It's governance. She paused, then added, Kyle, please step outside for a moment. His head snapped up. Excuse me, now, she said calmly. Kyle stood. anger flashing across his face. But he said nothing. The door closed behind him without ceremony. Inside the room, the air shifted. Someone exhaled. Another straightened their papers. The meeting continued without him. And for the first time since this began, the conversation felt balanced. Order returned, not because anyone raised their voice, but because facts had finally been allowed to sit where authority used to be. I sat still, hands folded, watching the system correct itself. No speeches followed, no apologies offered. The board didn't need emotion to reach alignment. They needed clarity. Kyle's absence said more than any vote could. Decisions moved faster without him. Calmer, too. In that room. Justice wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, measured, and irreversible. And everyone there understood the difference. It marked the end of impulse leadership and the quiet return of accountability the company had been missing for far too long there. When the vote concluded, there was no applause, just a brief pause. Then the board chair spoke with deliberate calm. Kyle Norton was removed effective immediately, cited for governance failure and material risk exposure. The words were clinical, unemotional, exactly how accountability sounds when it finally arrives. Kyle didn't argue. He stared at the table as if it had betrayed him, then stood and walked out without another sentence. No escort, no speech, no dignity salvaged. The door closed softly behind him, and with it went the frantic energy that had poisoned every decision he touched. Order returned almost instantly. The CFO straightened his notes. Legal began outlining next steps. Someone asked about vendor communications. These were real questions, operational questions, the kind that signal recovery instead of panic. I listened, detached but attentive, watching the company settle back into rhythm. The chair turned to me. "We'd like to discuss the lease," she said carefully. "The adjustment is valid, but we're hoping to renegotiate terms." I nodded. "I'm open to a conversation," I replied. Not a rollback. There was no pressure, no threats, just recognition. They understood now that leverage wasn't aggression. It was preparation meeting consequence. We discussed timelines, benchmarks, and safeguards. The numbers softened. The structure improved. Stability returned. One clause at a time. Someone finally asked the question they'd been circling. "Would you consider returning the chair?" said. "In an operational capacity?" I shook my head. No. That answer surprised them more than the rent increase ever had. I explained without bitterness. I had already served. I had already built. What I wanted now was distance, not authority. Control didn't require a title anymore. We finalized a revised lease framework before adjourning. Fair terms. Clear oversight. No shortcuts disguised as vision. The company would survive. Stronger for having learned the cost of arrogance. As I left the building, nothing dramatic happened. No one followed. No one applauded. That was fine. Justice rarely announces itself. It settles quietly, like a system returning to spec after a long deviation. Kyle Norton believed leadership meant momentum without friction. The board believed governance meant protection without ego. I believed contracts told the truth long after people stopped listening. Walking away, I felt satisfaction without triumph. The structure held. The damage stopped. Order had been restored. Not because someone won, but because reality had been allowed to take control again, exactly where it belonged. It was enough to know the system corrected itself. I didn't need recognition, credit, or revenge. I needed proof that preparation outlasts impulse. As the company recalibrated, I moved on. Certain of one thing: when structure is respected, justice doesn't shout, it works. That understanding was worth more than any title I ever held, and it stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Inside that quiet room, peace arrived quietly after the meetings ended. No follow-up calls, no victory laps, no urgency, just documents moving through proper channels and decisions being implemented without spectacle. That calm told me everything I needed to know. Within a week, the board approved revised lease terms. The rent was no longer punitive, but it was firm. Transparency was written into every page. Reporting requirements, audit access, and escalation triggers replaced vague authority. most important. The language granting any executive full restructuring power was removed entirely. No more unchecked transformations. No more vision without accountability. I signed the new agreement without ceremony. It wasn't a concession, it was a correction. The company needed stability, not saviors. The lease would now do what it was always meant to do: enforce discipline when enthusiasm outran judgment. People assumed I'd demand a role in return, a seat, a title, leverage made visible. I didn't. Control didn't interest me anymore. Influence through structure was quieter and far more durable. I chose distance because distance keeps perspective clean. The company adjusted quickly. Vendors resumed normal terms. Clients lifted their pauses. Internal calendars filled with routine instead of crisis. Nobody mentioned Kyle's name. Systems don't mourn removed components. They rebalance. I walked the building one last time after the paperwork cleared. Not to reminisce. Not to inspect. Just to confirm what I already knew. The place felt stable again. Predictable. Boring in the best way. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment restored. I hadn't raised my voice, issued threats, or demanded apologies. I had relied on preparation, patience, and language written long before emotions entered the equation. Nothing else needed proving. The leverage had done its work, quietly, completely. What remained was a functioning organization and a clear boundary between leadership and ownership. One defined by contracts instead of personalities, by limits instead of ego that lasted longer than any executive mandate ever. As I left, I felt no need to look back. Outcomes don't require witnesses. The truth had already settled into the foundation. Kyle thought he ran the company. I owned the floor he stood on. What stayed with me wasn't the win, it was the quiet moment when I realized preparation outlives power. I didn't raise my voice or chase revenge. I trusted the work I'd done when no one was watching. The clauses I'd read when others skimmed. The patience to let systems speak. Living through it felt less like triumph and more like breathing again, steady, grounded, human. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. Which detail hit you the hardest? And where are you listening from right now? If this resonated, leave a comment. I read them. A like or share helps this reach someone who needs it, and subscribing means you won't miss the next story. Sometimes justice doesn't shout, it holds.